All right, strap in, everyone, because today we're going deep, really deep into the Boston Strangler case.
You've really compiled some amazing research here, I have to say.
Oh, yeah. I went a little crazy.
It's a fascinating case, though, isn't it? I mean, it's been decades, and we're still debating the truth about Albert DeSalvo. Was he really the only one behind these horrific murders that terrified Boston? Or could there be more to uncover, something we've all missed?
That's what we're going to find out, right?
Exactly. We're going to try to piece this all together.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a lot here to unpack, for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, I know you're already pretty familiar with the basics of this case, but just to set the scene for our listeners.
Yeah.
Imagine Boston back in the early 1960s.
All right.
This sense of unease starts creeping in as women are being found murdered in their own homes.
Right.
It's between 1962 and 64, and over that time, 13 victims are discovered.
13, yeah.
And they ranged in age from just 19 all the way to 85.
It's a chilling thought, and it wasn't just the number of victims, right? It was those eerie similarities in their deaths that really got under people's skin. You find that most of them were strangled, and not just with anything, but with things like stockings or scarves.
Right, personal items.
Yeah, things you'd find right there in their apartments.
Exactly.
And often, there wasn't even any sign of forced entry. I mean, that detail alone, it must have been terrifying for everyone, knowing the killer could be anyone, even someone they trusted.
It's scary just thinking about it.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
And then, the media gets involved, which of course just adds fuel to the fire.
Of course.
And they come up with the name the Boston Strangler. But here's where things take an interesting turn. Initially, Albert DeSalvo, he wasn't even on the radar as a suspect for these murders.
Nope, not at all.
Not at first.
Yeah.
So how does he even enter the picture?
Right, well, he had a past.
A
troubled past, you could say.
Yeah.
Marked by, well, everything, petty, crime, abuse, neglect.
It's all in there.
Yeah, the whole 9 yards. But what really put him on the map were the Green Man assaults.
The Green Man assaults, right?
Yeah, and this is back in '64.
Okay.
And what he would do is he'd pose as, say, a worker or someone harmless, someone you wouldn't think twice about.
Right.
And he'd use that guise to gain a woman's trust,
Gain their trust and then...
And then attack.
Wow.
It's unsettling, how that echoes the way the Strangler victims might have been approached, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that parallel is definitely unsettling, to say the least.
It is.
So we see he has this potential to manipulate, to overpower women.
Yeah.
But the heart of this whole case, the real turning point, I think, is his confession.
Would you say so?
I would.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Okay.
So how does it all come out? Well, DeSalvo, he ends up confessing to a fellow inmate, this guy named George Nassar, right? And then Nassar, he goes and relays all this to F. Lee Bailey, who eventually becomes DeSalvo's attorney.
Wow. Okay.
And the details in DeSalvo's confession, I mean, they're shocking, really accurate.
And the detail, the specificity, you pointed that out.
It's all there.
It's incredible.
It is. I mean, he describes the crime scenes, the methods used, even things that weren't public knowledge yet. You almost get the feeling like he was there,
It's eerie how accurate it is, but, and this is a big BUT,
yeah,
there's no physical evidence directly linking him to any of the Strangler murders.
Nope.
Not a fingerprint, not a fiber, nothing concrete.
Not a shred.
And that's where the doubts start to creep in, right?
Absolutely, and that's where things get really interesting. See, some investigators started thinking maybe DeSalvo was just seeking attention, trying to make a name for himself through this horrible case.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't you?
I guess so.
And there were even rumors flying around about a possible deal with Nassar that maybe the confession was all made up, a fabrication.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And another thing, some of DeSalvo's accounts, they had discrepancies, details that didn't quite line up with the evidence.
Right. I noticed that in the research, too.
Yeah, it's there.
Like, there were things about the victim's appearances that he got wrong, and details about the crime scenes that were off, just slightly off.
Yeah, so it makes you wonder, right? Could he have gotten some of that information from the media? Or maybe even from leaks within the investigation itself.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it kind of opens up the door to another possibility, right? That maybe it wasn't just one person behind all 13 murders.
You got it.
Maybe it was multiple people. And maybe DeSalvo was either totally innocent or only involved in some of them.
You're on the right track there.
Wow. And if that's the case, Imagine the fear that would have created back then.
Oh, absolutely.
They're looking for answers, trying to make sense of it all, and all this is happening before DNA technology,
Right.
before we had the tools we have now.
We're talking about a time when investigations relied heavily on, eyewitness accounts, which are often unreliable.
Oh, for sure.
And of course, confessions, which, as we see here, can be pretty murky, can't they?
Totally, totally.
It makes you really appreciate how much things have changed.
I know, right? Imagine being an investigator back then.
Oh, yeah.
You've got all this pressure to solve these cases.
A city on edge.
Exactly. People are terrified, and you're stuck with these limited tools and so much uncertainty.
I know, it had to be incredibly frustrating. I can't even imagine.
It would be. But so DeSalvo, even though he was never formally charged with the Boston Strangler murders, he ends up convicted for the Green Man assaults.
Right, and he gets sentenced to life in prison.
So it's almost ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
He becomes infamous for crimes he never even went to trial for.
That's the way it goes sometimes.
I guess so. And then, just to make things even more complicated, he's murdered in prison in '73, stabbed in his cell.
Yeah, another unsolved crime tied to this already convoluted case.
Exactly. It's like a whole other mystery within a mystery.
Isn't it?
And it makes you think, even in prison, under constant watch, he couldn't escape the violence.
It's a chilling thought, It really makes you wonder if he knew more than he let on. Maybe even if his murder was somehow connected to the Strangler case.
Oh, yeah. That just fuels all the conspiracy theories even more.
Oh, of course.
But going back to DeSalvo for a moment, it's wild how, even though he wasn't convicted of the Strangler murders, that's what he's known for.
Yeah, his name became synonymous with the Boston Strangler, even though we still don't know the full story.
Right. Whether it's entirely accurate or not, that association became part of his legacy.
It's a powerful example of how public perception can overshadow everything else, even legal proceedings.
Absolutely.
I mean, think about it. DeSalvo became the symbol of the fear that gripped Boston, even though the full truth of his involvement might never be known.
Yeah, it's like his story, even with all the missing pieces, it became this dark legend.
That's a great way to put it.
And it shows how certain crimes, even after all these years, they just capture our imagination,
They do, and you know why? It's our fascination with the dark side of human nature.
Oh, yeah.
The idea that someone seemingly ordinary can commit these horrific acts.
And the mystery, right.
Of course, the unanswered questions that keep us coming back for more, trying to crack the code, piece it all together.
That's the beauty of a good mystery.
Absolutely.
It keeps us thinking, keeps us guessing. And then in this case, you throw in the DNA evidence that comes later.
Right.
That's a game changer.
It's huge. And you know what? This case still manages to hold on to its secrets, even with these advancements.
Oh, for sure. That's what makes it so captivating.
It really is.
But before we jump into that, I think it's important to take a step back and understand the context, the limitations investigators were up against back then, the impact this case had, not just on Boston, but beyond.
You're right. The historical context is crucial here, to really appreciate the complexities of this whole story. We've got societal anxieties. We've got the evolution of forensic science. It all plays a part.
It all ties in.
It does.
Yeah.
It really does.
All right, so we've laid out the scene. This terrifying time in Boston, everyone's on edge.
Right, yeah.
And now let's fast forward, way forward, to 2013.
Okay.
DNA technology, it's come a long way, right?
Oh, absolutely. Light years ahead of where it was.
And authorities decide to exhume DeSalvo's body to compare his DNA with evidence from the last victim, Mary Sullivan.
That's right.
This is almost 50 years after the murders, and it's potentially, the key to unlocking this mystery that has haunted people for generations.
It was a huge gamble, really, but it had the potential to be a massive turning point in the case.
Definitely.
Remember, DeSalvo confessed, but there was never any physical evidence tying him to any of the Strangler victims while he was alive.
Right.
So extracting DNA from his remains, comparing it to samples from Mary Sullivan's case, it was a long shot.
It was. And the results, I have to admit, reading through your notes about this part, I was hooked.
Oh, yeah.
I was totally on the edge of my seat.
Well, the results were, I'd say, pretty stunning, They found a match.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
DeSalvo's DNA, it matched the biological evidence from Mary Sullivan's crime scene.
So after all these years, they finally had concrete evidence connecting him to at least one of the Boston Strangler murders.
At least one, that's the key here.
That's huge, though. I mean,
It is.
Doesn't it kind of blow the whole case wide open again?
It does in a way, but then it raises another question.
No way.
Does this prove he was behind all 13 murders? Or does it just make the mystery even deeper?
Right, right. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think you've pointed out some really interesting arguments in your research.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the DNA evidence is a major breakthrough, no doubt.
Oh, yeah.
But we have to remember it only definitively links him to Mary Sullivan's murder.
Right, just that one.
Yeah, it doesn't automatically mean he was responsible for the others.
No.
The possibility of others being involved, it's still very much there.
So even with all this advanced technology, we're still left with these uncertainties.
We are, which is fascinating, I think, and a little frustrating.
Yeah, a little bit of both. And it makes you think about how hard it must have been to investigate crimes back in the 60s.
Oh, absolutely. Can you imagine being an investigator back then?
No, I don't think so.
You're relying on eyewitness accounts.
Which are often unreliable.
Exactly, and circumstantial evidence and the pressure to solve the case with the whole city in a panic.
Yeah, I bet it was immense.
The Boston Strangler case really shows how far we've come, in terms of forensic science and how we investigate crimes.
It's like night and day. The tools they had then versus what we have now.
Absolutely.
But that DNA evidence, it's like it shines a light on some things, but it doesn't clear away all the shadows of doubt.
Nope, not at all.
It kind of adds another layer to the whole
Yeah,
thing.
it does. It's like DeSalvo's role becomes both clearer and more ambiguous at the same time.
That's a good way to put it.
What I find particularly interesting is, you've looked into some of the alternative theories surrounding the case.
I have.
For example, the idea that DeSalvo might have been part of a larger group,
Yeah.
maybe acting as a follower or even an accomplice rather than the mastermind.
That's a really interesting theory. And if that's true,
Yeah.
what was the motive? If DeSalvo wasn't the only one, what was driving all of this?
That's a great question. And it's hard to say for sure, right? I mean, was it all about power and control? Or were there other things going on? Other factors were missing.
That's where things get really interesting, I think.
They do. And your research actually touches on some really interesting psychological profiles.
Oh, yeah.
It suggests there might be a link between DeSalvo's troubled childhood
Right.
and his actions later in life.
Right. And that connection between trauma and violence it's really fascinating, but also really complex.
It is. It's a tricky one to unpack for sure.
So some psychologists, they argue that when someone experiences severe abuse or neglect, they might develop a distorted view of power and control,
Yeah.
and they might try to exert dominance over others as a way to compensate for those feelings of vulnerability.
It's like they're trying to regain a sense of control that was taken from them.
It's like a coping mechanism, but a really, really destructive one.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that this is just one possible explanation, right?
Of course.
We can't generalize or draw definitive conclusions about everyone who's experienced trauma.
No, definitely not. It's a very individualized thing.
It is.
But it's definitely a thought-provoking idea to consider, especially given, how brutal these crimes were.
And it also leads to another question.
Okay.
If DeSalvo wasn't acting alone, who else might have been involved? Were there people who influenced him, manipulated him, maybe even directed his actions?
That's where things get really interesting, right?
Okay.
The idea of a larger conspiracy,
Yeah,
it opens up so many possibilities.
it does.
Were there others out there who shared his tendencies toward violence? Or were they using him for their own, twisted purposes?
It's a rabbit hole, for sure. And your research also delves into the impact of media coverage.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, this was when newspapers and television were the main sources of information.
Right. That was it.
And the media frenzy around the Boston Strangler, it was unlike anything they'd seen before.
I can only imagine.
And it definitely influenced public perception and maybe even shaped how the investigation went.
Yeah, you can totally see how the constant headlines, the speculation,
Yeah.
all the fear-mongering, it would have put a ton of pressure on law enforcement
Of course.
to find the killer, maybe even making them overlook crucial details or other theories just to close the case and appease everyone.
It's a cautionary tale, isn't it?
It is.
About the power of the media, how it can shape how we see things.
Absolutely.
And in this case, the media's portrayal of the Boston Strangler, this almost mythical figure, it might have actually obscured the truth.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even when we're striving for justice, we can't forget the human element,
Absolutely.
the nuances, and the fact that truth is often a lot more complicated than we want it to be.
Speaking of truth, you highlighted another really interesting point in your research.
Yeah.
The evolution of forensic science.
Oh, yeah, right. We've already talked about DNA. But there were other advancements that played a role, maybe not groundbreaking, but still important.
Definitely.
You mentioned something about the use of psychological profiling,
Uh-huh.
which was pretty new back then.
It was still in its early stages.
What are your thoughts on that, especially considering how complex DeSalvo's personality seemed to be, and the potential role of mental illness in all of this?
Right. Well, psychological profiling, it was just starting to gain traction as a tool to try and understand criminal behavior.
Right.
And with the Boston Strangler, investigators actually consulted with psychiatrists and psychologists.
Did they?
Yeah, they were trying to build a profile of the killer,
Okay.
hoping to narrow down the suspects, maybe even predict what he would do next.
Wow, that's like putting together a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
It's a great analogy.
I can't even imagine how difficult that must have been, especially back then, with the limited understanding of mental health.
And the stigma surrounding it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, mental illness was often misunderstood, misrepresented,
For sure.
and people often oversimplified or sensationalized the connection between mental health and crime.
It's true, and it raises a really important ethical question.
What's that?
How do you balance public safety with the rights and well-being of people who might be struggling with mental health?
Yeah, that's a delicate balance, and we're still figuring that out today, aren't we?
We are, but, you made a crucial point earlier.
Yeah.
Mental health, it's not a predictor of criminal behavior.
That's so important to remember.
It is, in fact. People with mental illness are more likely to be victims of crime than perpetrators.
That's a really good point.
And, even with all the advancements we've made
Right.
in forensic science and profiling,
Uh-huh.
we can't perfectly predict human behavior.
No, never fully. There's always that element of the unknown,
Always.
that X factor.
Right, and I think that's part of what makes these cases so captivating.
I agree.
They remind us that no matter how much we try to understand the human mind,
Yeah.
there will always be mysteries that we just can't solve.
And that brings us back to the Boston Strangler,
Yeah.
this case that still captivates us all these years later. Why is that? What is it about this particular case that's just stuck with us?
I've thought about that a lot.
Yeah.
And I think it has something to do with how it tapped into those primal fears,
Yeah.
The idea that someone could be lurking in the shadows, preying on the vulnerable.
It's terrifying, but I also think it's the mystery itself, the questions that are still unanswered.
Oh, of course.
Did DeSalvo act alone?
Yeah.
Were there others involved?
Right.
What were they after?
These questions, they keep the speculation alive.
They do.
And they've inspired so many books, documentaries, even fictional stories about the case.
It's become this cultural touchstone, a case that people just keep coming back to.
Yeah, and analyzing.
And I think that's partly because it happened during such a pivotal time of change, right?
That's a great point. The 60s, it was a time of upheaval, right?
Totally.
Everything was being challenged.
Everything.
And the Boston Strangler case, with its focus on women as victims and the violation of those domestic spaces, it kind of tapped into the anxieties people had about how society was changing.
Changing roles of women, all of that.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting way to look at it.
I think it's important to remember the impact this case had on the victims' families.
Oh, absolutely.
And on Boston as a whole.
Yeah, the fear, the trauma, it left a mark.
For sure, a reminder that even in places that feel safe and familiar, darkness can find a way in.
It's a tough thing to think about, but I think it's important to acknowledge that, to not just focus on the sensational aspects.
Absolutely.
We have to remember the people, the lives that were lost, and the impact it continues to have.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the intrigue and the mystery.
Oh, yeah, it's easy to get swept away.
But we need to remember the human side of it all.
Absolutely.
The empathy, the respect for the victims and their families, that's crucial.
And that's one of the reasons why we keep revisiting these cases. Right?
You got it.
To keep asking questions, keep searching for answers.
It's about honoring the victims, seeking justice, and trying to understand the complexities of human behavior, the good and the bad.
Well said. Well said.
And I think this is a perfect time to move on to the next chapter of our deep dive.
Okay, what do we have next?
You highlighted some really compelling research about DeSalvo's time in prison,
Oh, yeah.
his interactions with other inmates, and even his attempts to take back his confession.
Right, and then there's his murder, which is a whole other mystery in itself.
It's like the story just keeps going.
Yeah, like peeling back the layers of an onion.
And with each layer, we
Yeah.
just find more questions, more complexities, and get a deeper look into the dark heart of this case.
That's the beauty of a true deep dive, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Embracing the unknown, challenging what we think we know, and recognizing that the truth is, well, it's often a moving target.
That's a great way to put it.
It's amazing how this case still has the power to surprise us even after all this time.
It really does.
But before we get too deep into that rabbit hole,
Right.
you had mentioned some interesting stuff about DeSalvo's life after his conviction.
Yeah.
What did you find there?
Well, it's a part of the story that often gets lost, overshadowed by all the sensationalism around the murders.
Yeah, I could see that.
You see, even in prison DeSalvo, he remained a bit of an enigma.
Oh, really?
There were accounts from other inmates, guards, that painted a conflicting picture.
How so?
Some described him as quiet, almost remorseful, while others said he'd boast about the murders, reveling in the attention.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It is almost like he was playing different parts for different people.
Yeah, or maybe battling his own demons, right?
That could be too, We can't really know for sure, but you flagged a particularly fascinating detail in your research.
Oh, yeah.
DeSalvo's attempts to recant his confession.
He tried to take it back.
He did. He claimed he was pressured into confessing.
Wow.
That he was promised a lighter sentence if he played the part of the Boston Strangler.
That's a bombshell, and it makes you wonder about the methods investigators used back then.
It does.
I mean, were they so determined to solve the case, to calm everyone down,
Yeah.
that they might have overlooked things or even manipulated DeSalvo into confessing?
That's a question that's been debated for years.
It has.
And you have to remember, back then, interrogation techniques weren't as regulated as they are now.
Right.
And the idea of false confessions, well, it wasn't as widely understood.
It's chilling to think about, how someone, especially under pressure, could be convinced to confess to something they didn't do.
It's a scary thought, and it really highlights those bigger questions about truth and justice, right?
Yeah, the flaws in the system, even with the DNA evidence linking DeSalvo to Mary Sullivan's murder.
Right.
There are still questions about whether his confession was real and whether he acted alone.
It's a puzzle with missing pieces, and then you add in DeSalvo's murder.
In prison.
Yeah, stabbed in his cell in 73, and the case is still unsolved.
It's like something out of a movie.
It is. The infamous killer meeting a violent end.
Do you think his murder was connected to the Strangler case?
It's possible there were rumors that he knew things about other crimes, or that he was going to name names, reveal accomplices.
Wow.
But it's all just speculation without any hard proof.
This case is it's a maze, a labyrinth of twists and turns.
It is, isn't it?
We've gone from the fear in the streets of Boston to the labs analyzing DNA, and now we're back in a prison cell.
Yeah, and it shows just how much this case continues to fascinate us decades later.
I'm curious, what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from all of this?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is that truth is rarely simple.
Right.
The Boston Strangler case shows how our understanding of things can change over time.
As new evidence comes to light.
Exactly, and old assumptions are challenged.
It reminds us that we should always be open to new information, question what we think we know, and remember that finding justice is a process.
A journey, really.
Yeah. It's a great way to look at it. A reminder to be humble, to recognize that we don't have all the answers, and that searching for the truth it's a constant effort.
And don't forget the importance of critical thinking.
Yes.
Weighing the evidence and not falling for easy answers.
Because things are rarely black and white.
Exactly.
The Boston Strangler case, it's a lesson in how complicated investigations can be.
It is.
How elusive truth can be. And the power of a mystery that just won't let go.
It also shows the impact of these crimes on people, on families, on communities.
Yeah, the fear, the grief, the search for answers.
Those things, they stay with you.
Long after the news stories have moved on.
So as we wrap up our deep dive here, it's important to remember the victims, their families, and the impact all of this had on Boston.
Absolutely. We can't let the time that's passed diminish the tragedy of what happened.
And for our listeners who are, I hope, as fascinated by this case as we are, there's so much out there to explore. Your research already pointed to some great books and documentaries.
Yeah, I did a lot of reading.
And I'd recommend checking out some of the newer podcasts and articles.
Yeah, there's always new information coming out.
That offer new perspectives, new insights.
There are some amazing podcasts out there that really dig deep into forensics, profiling, the psychology of it all.
It's a case that keeps unfolding.
Yeah. It does.
Even after all these years, there's still potential for new discoveries, maybe even closure for those who were affected.
It's a reminder that history isn't static.
No, it's not.
The past keeps talking to us, sometimes in ways we don't expect.
So to our listener, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Yeah, don't let anyone tell you what to think.
The world of true crime, it's a fascinating place, a bit unsettling at times.
It is?
But it teaches you a lot about human nature and our search for justice.
I agree. Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into the Boston Strangler case.
It does. It's been a wild ride for sure.
Full of twists and turns and so many unanswered questions.
It has, and I want to thank you, our listener, for your incredible research.
Oh, you're welcome.
And for inspiring us to dive into this case.
It's been a pleasure exploring it with you.
Likewise, and until next time.
Yeah, keep exploring, keep questioning, and remember, never underestimate a good mystery.
That's good advice.
All right, folks, that's all for today. Thanks for joining us.
If you enjoyed this video and want to dive deeper into more cases like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like the video if you found the story compelling, and share it with your friends and family who might be interested in true crime and mysteries. By subscribing, you'll stay up to date with all our latest content and join a growing community of curious minds exploring the most fascinating cases. Click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything.